If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies. For being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise. If you can dream, and not make dreams your master. If you can think, and not make thoughts your aim. If you can meet with triumph and disaster, and treat those two impostors just the same. If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to, broken, and stoop and build them up with worn-out tools. If you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn at pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss.
Because really, nobody else.
If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you, except the will that says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch. If neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And which is more, you'll be a man, my son.
One night in, I think it was 2017, I ran away from home. It was one of those stupidities of youth, blaming everyone else for my own problems and lashing out against those who tried to hold me dear. Looking back, it was a despicable and selfish act, but I would learn that only a short while later. Wandering around the streets of Frankfurt, the city I lived in at the time, I had no idea of where to go until I decided to spend the night at the gym. Having arrived, I sat down and tried to drown out my mind in videos I had downloaded to my phone. I did not want to think about what I had just done, I just wanted out. Then, roughly 50 minutes after I had sat down on the gym's couch, a strange man approached me. I remembered thinking that his face reminded me of a cross between Willem Dafoe and John Bon Jovi. He joked about my bag. I told him I had run away from home. He asked if he was allowed to sit down. I allowed him. That was the night I learned about power. The man, whose name I never asked and whom I would never see again, told me that 10,000 men had come to that very same gym in the pursuit of power, but that only a few had ever given it any real modicum of thought. He asked me what people do at a gym. I told him they lifted weights. He told me they moved heavy things around. He explained to me that all power in the end breaks down into the ability to move something. The powerful man might not have muscles or money or status, but when he wishes something to move that otherwise wouldn't, it moves. As his power grows, so do the things that move according to his will. He came back to my problem and asked if I wanted things to change from how they were. I told him yes. He told me that in that case I should either find out how to move things myself or to find someone who did. The simple genius of this definition of power has been with me ever since. Power is the ability to move something. The more powerful you are, the more you can move around. Physical power moves physical objects, social power moves people, electrical power moves electrons, and so on and so forth. An older word for movement here that serves to universalize the concept is actualization. The concepts of act and potential have been mentioned before on this channel, so it's about time that I explain them. A thing's act or actual form is what a thing is currently. For example, a piece of glass is a piece of glass. A thing's potential is what it can be. For example, a piece of glass has the potential to become a wine glass. Taking a thing from what it is to what it can be is called actualization. For example, a glassblower with the right equipment has the ability to actualize the potential of a piece of glass to become a wine glass. A builder has the ability to actualize the potential of raw materials to form a house, and a painter has the ability to actualize the potential of a white wall to become a green wall. As such, each actualized entity has at least one cause for its existence. In terms of causation, we then distinguish into two different primary types of causation: accidental causation and essential causation, which also correspond to the behaviors of the general position that we have mentioned in previous videos. Accidental causation is the giving of an impulse which then carries on its own. For example, after the glassblower has actualized the ability of the glass to become a wine glass, he can then close up shop and never practice again, and yet the wine glass will remain as a wine glass. This form of causation can be described by Newton's first law of motion. Once things have been set into motion, or actualized, they stay in motion. The second type of causation is essential causation. Essential causation describes the maintenance of a form that otherwise would subside. A good example is how electricity maintains the functionality of a mobile app. As soon as the electricity subsides, so does the app. Another example lifted from economics is the trust in a currency. It is generally taught that an economy is only functional as long as people trust in its currency. As soon as this trust stops, the economy collapses. Essential causation follows a foundational structure. Each cause is essential to its effect, and as soon as a cause is removed, the overlaying effects vanish. The first accidental cause is generally believed to be the Big Bang. The first essential cause was historically identified with God, and despite a lot of attempts in recent history to overturn this verdict, no alternative or rebuke has so far yielded any results. An easy conclusion drawn from this is that God is power. And indeed, that is the commonality amongst all pagan religions, which ultimately venerate power. In the Eastern tradition, this power is Taiji, which is born of Tao, which in turn is the supreme law of existence. Although Chinese theology also features a trinity called the Sanqing, which is the manifestation of the Tao, these fall under Trinitarian heresies, as they ultimately still result in a Tao that is fundamentally nameless and faceless, different from the personal God in Christianity. Instead, one participates in the Tao by practice of it and participation in the Tai Chi, a cosmic force that can be seen as a form of meta-power. It is almost synonymous with the Hindu concept of prana, from which Western ideas of orgone or thrill developed in the late 19th and the 20th century, all of which essentially describe meta-power. Meta-power can be best explained as such. Different kinds of powers can be converted into one another. Electrical energy can be converted into heat energy, which can be converted into kinetic energy, and so on and so forth. However, all these different types of powers, electric, kinetic, heat, magnetic, financial, etc., all follow the same behavior. All behave as powers ought to. Meta-power is then the exercise of this power or pattern of behavior regardless of its context. So, essentially the ability to move anything. It has been well illustrated and since become part of Western consciousness in 1977 when the first Star Wars movies introduced the Force. It is unimportant whether or not meta-power exists physically, as consideration of its qualities gives us a general understanding of power, and as such, whenever we talk about power from now on, we will talk about meta-power. Power has no agency of its own. Rather, it can be wielded towards any end deemed fit, as long as its working is being respected. As such, power is present as a feminine element. It is neither good nor evil. However, it relates to both. It is, for example, evil's substitute for love, so those who need love are instead given power. This is something that has happened in the West for almost a century now. Whenever a group was identified that was downtrodden and met with ill fortune, it was subsequently empowered, which was supposed to make the situation go away. Instead, however, many groups kept their resentment because it often wasn't power they needed but care, compassion, and love. This can make it seem as if power itself is evil. However, as previously mentioned, it has no inherent agency. The good use of power might instead best be illustrated in Mark 10:42-45. Here Christ taught the disciples that the most powerful ought to be at service of those they rule over. This service should not be understood as submissive enabling of the lower's every whim, or as it is in the business world, where the more excellent the service provider, the more savage the person taking the service can be. Instead, it has to be understood as the service a good father renders upon his family, selflessly giving all, both as a teacher and as a provider, as an aid and advisor, as a rock to be leaned on, and as an icon to be imitated. A further insight can be grasped from the Greek translation, which also equates service with mediation, and as such the servant becomes the mediator between those he serves and that which may appear hostile or unknown to them, just as Christ became the mediator between heaven and earth. As such, we may well say that in heaven all power is justified by the nobility of its wielders, while in hell all power is simply justified by itself. Similarly, on earth, a good place is one that seeks to combine power with nobility, whilst a bad place is one where power is treated as one may treat an oil well, with 100 arms reaching out for its treasure, scratching out one another's fingers in pursuit of it. As such, the desire for power is something perverse, like the lust for money or women or glory, whilst the having of power is something that cries for ennoblement of those invested with it. Over the course of one's life, an individual's power is often grown out, and as such he has to recognize its function and nature to become a worthy steward of his endowment. To understand this, he first has to understand that although the power rests with him, it is not grown with him, but rather amplified through a myriad of conduits, whether they be levers, organizations, or machines, or whatever the shape the power takes. These amplifications, which can be envisioned as the vehicles of his enlarged powers, will henceforth be known as dominion. To understand dominion, I first want to explain systems. A system is a cohesive group of elements that relate to one another. Systems are defined by an order. To illustrate this, we may once again dive into the realm of thermodynamics and entropy. The water in a glass of water is a system with maximum entropy, or in a state of pure chaos. As temperature decreases, so does the system's entropy, and it begins to form a structure, namely in the form of ice crystals. We can imagine this in other scenarios as well. Imagine 1,000 people sent to an island. As soon as initial commotion has settled down, we expect different groups to form, each of which is its own structure or order. Such clusters are then centered around a central point. In the case of a snowflake, this may be the point that holds the most mass. In the case of the social groups, these may be the most central figures to a group. For additional illustration, I designed this simulation of balls flying randomly through empty space. After a while, something akin to gravity activates, whereby the balls all attract one another, forming then a system of interrelated elements. Presence or absence of this simulated gravity is indicated by the color of the center ball, whose perspective we take. As the simulation shows, the balls start to form different clusters as soon as the simulated gravity kicks in. These clusters can again be seen as the concentrations of different tangible things that take place once chaos recedes, whether it be the formation of nations, snowflakes, ecosystems, or other things. In Machiavellian terms, these are the different chords that organize around a single power center at the middle. In the real world, the sizes of such clusters follow different distribution laws, most commonly the Pareto distribution, where 20% of clusters hold 80% of whatever measures cluster magnitude, so mass or weight or size or energy or wealth, etc. So for example, 20% of people in an economy hold 80% of its wealth, where each individual's wealth forms one cluster. As molecules start to freeze towards absolute zero, 20% of frozen clusters hold 80% of molecules, and 20% of human settlements hold 80% of the world's population. This exponentially decaying distribution makes the Pareto distribution a so-called power law. A power law is a law whereby the transformation of one property to another is marked by an exponential relationship. As of the making of this video, the deeper meaning of mathematical functions has not been discussed, even though it is scheduled beforehand. Yet, I will briefly glance over it again. A function is the transfer of an element from one set to another. As such, the change between two states or the change between two actualized forms is described by a function which essentially transcribes the transformation process. A power law, or an exponential function, then describes a transformation of states that is marked by leverage, or what Renaissance thinkers called mechanical advantage, and I will put a link in the description that explains Renaissance ideas of mechanical advantage and simple machines. This is how dominion functions and is operated. It is structured in such a way that it gives mechanical advantage to those who operate it. That is, the top needs only to enact the most subtle changes to yield colossal effects. A simple example is an army structure, where the movement of a commander's arm translates into the charging of a full battalion. A more poetic example may again be the force, where individuals only need to vaguely stretch out their hands to lift massive objects. An important fact reality teaches us is that none of these structures are rigid. In reality, all systems oscillate or vibrate at different frequencies, so cities, countries, bodies, economies, machines, or even fabrics such as glass all have a vibration to them called their resonance. If a system consists of various subsystems, each of these may have a different resonance, but they all have to be in some form of sync. And the best way to illustrate this is once again an orchestra. but different instruments may play in different tacts. However, the tacts are synced up to a form of total harmony between all instruments. Any further contemplations of this character of resonance will be reserved to the addendums. Dominion comes in a variety of shapes. The dominion inherent to each man is his inner realm, his mental garden. For men, these dominions then typically extend into their families, their houses, and often some forms of organizations of people. For women, they tend to extend into the home, the children, and sometimes into forms of clubs or societies. From the reference point of each individual, their dominion and any dominion they associate with is seen as a kingdom that grows out into the wilderness, or an order that extends itself into chaos. And since chaos is always encroaching, they need to know how to wield it. The first point in wielding the leverage effect of a dominion is that the dominion must be receptive to this. Political theorist Bertrand de Jouvenel, whose book we will cover in one of the addendums to this video, describes this requirement, which he called obedience, as the composure of three elements: creed, credence, and credit. So for the general to lead an army, he needs to pursue a creed that the army accepts, have the credence to call himself general, and enough credit to his abilities that the soldiers trust his commands to be good. But this is not just a socio-political phenomenon. Minds' different personalities will give their desires or craving different justifications. So craving for sugar will be dressed up in ideas like, "Oh, I'm not supposed to eat sugar today, but I really want to try out this new candy," or "I will just eat a bit of sweets. I need some sugar after all." Each time the correspondent subpersonality will mask its simple craving with other creeds, credences, and/or credits. Once sovereignty over the dominion has been achieved, however, the practice of yielding it is an act that finds its best explanation in one of the West's most forgotten symbols, the chariot. Until the automotive age, the chariot described one of the fastest, most dominant forms of movement known to man. It symbolizes potency, power, and triumph. Its symbol comprises four parts: the animal or animals pulling the chariot, the wheel bound by an axle, the charioteer, and the frame that connects these three. The wheel spinning around the axle is a symbol we have already explored in the procession cycles video. The rider represents the general position that only needs to expend little efforts by means of the frame and the reins to steer the chariot, as such reigning over it. The horse represents the energy of the dominion. It is much more powerful than the rider, and if he loses the reins or the frame cracks, this may spell serious injury and even death to him, just as the French Revolution did to Louis XVI. The nature of the horse also serves as a hint to the fact that power is not something created but something partaken in. In the East, this is most apparent in the philosophy behind Feng Shui. Although its practice is more than questionable, the underlying idea is quite sound. Feng Shui tries to capture and redirect the flow of qi to its own ends. It is commonly explained as such. A common man tries to cross a river by paddling over it in a rowboat, putting all his energy into the act of rowing and arriving exhausted at the other end. The Feng Shui master instead uses a sail to redirect the energy of the wind and arrives at the other end relaxed. To be able to not lose control of this much greater power, one must achieve a state of proportional equanimity, meaning as much as having an even mind. Equanimity designates a state of aloofness or loftiness that has the person emotionally unfazed and uninvested, by any developments in his dominion, be they for better or for worse. It has nothing to do with apathy, but rather with temperance and ultimately charity. It is exercised equally by a man who isn't fazed by his wife's freakout and instead remains calm and composed, and by a man who is able to keep his calm whilst negotiating the release of hostages, or a savvy investor who is unmoved by movements in the market. As such, equanimity is an imitation of God in a quite more literal reiteration of the unmoved mover. The road towards achieving the state of equanimity is in the modern world most commonly associated with various schools of Eastern paganism. For example, the Buddhists who teach one another to achieve it by focusing on the emptiness of the world. As such, they form an almost equal opposite to the Christian way of achieving equanimity, which is by focusing on God, who is the one to fill this emptiness. Once the dominion is firmly mastered, it is then steered towards an end. This end can be described as a new order. Since the highest order is Christ the Logos, being non-conforming to him means sin or evil. After all, evil is nothing but the privation of good. This gives us, on the one hand, an elegant and insightful solution to the problem of evil that can be typologically reiterated. For the Lord to not allow evil in his dominion means for him to be alone. However, it also puts in front of us a dilemma. For each successful victory might in the end be a defeat if its outcome is an order abject to Christ. The possibility of messing up seems to overwhelm and deter us from using our dominion to any end at all. One could even become a pathological pacifist who runs away from any problems that may arise. To justify any use of dominion, then, one has to recognize that one's action can easily become a bigger condemnation than one's passivity. We must ensure that we proceed with our best understanding of and subjugation to Christ the Logos. To this end, we must listen to our informed conscience while shutting out the voices of sin, something greatly aided by practicing examinations of conscience. We must practice forbearance to ensure that our creed is not tainted by a disposition towards dismissing the other party, and if we then proceed to the best of our ability, we may rest assured that even if our ends ultimately turn out to be sinful, we can make use of the sacraments to be forgiven once we have become alert to their sinful character. However, this means we must also take responsibility for our victories, which often means taking the new conquest into our dominion or into one that we have faith in. Presiding over this enlarged dominion that one takes responsibility for means exercising masculinity. In our time, masculinity is one of the least understood things in the world. So we will start by identifying its appearance in the natural world, and in order to do that, we will summarize some of the effects of testosterone. To that end, I will give the cliff notes of a video taken from Ryan Falk, which I will link in the description. The video points out 5 correlates of high testosterone. 1. Testosterone reduces disposition towards lying for one's own gain. 2. Higher testosterone increases charity towards others, even at one's own expense. 3. Higher testosterone builds a higher tendency to subjugate private good to public good. 4. Higher testosterone increases openness to minority positions bordering on contrarianism. And there are some interesting speculations on that within the video that I will omit here, but for which I highly recommend checking out the video afterwards. 5. High testosterone implies high social dominance yet low physical aggression. These points should not be surprising to Christians. After all, Christ represents the masculine ultimatum, and all of these correlations apply to him. Yet, especially the 5th point might be a conundrum to some, and so I will relay a story the historian Herodotus got from the Scythians. At an age that revered nobility and masculinity like nothing else, the Scythians were revered as the most noble of all, so I think we are in good company. Herodotus recalling a Scythian story. When therefore the children sprung from these slaves and the Scythian women grew to manhood and understood the circumstances of their birth, they resolved to oppose the Scythian army, which was returning from Media. And first of all, they cut off a tract of country from the rest of Scythia by digging a broad dike from the Tauric mountains to the vast lake of Maeotis. Afterwards, when the Scythians tried to force an entrance, they marched out and engaged them. Many battles were fought, and the Scythians gained no advantage until at last one of them thus addressed the remainder. "What are we doing, Scythians? We are fighting our slaves, diminishing our own number when we fall, and the number of those that belong to us when they fall by our hands. Take my advice. Lay spear and bow aside, and let each man fetch his horsewhip, and go boldly upon them. So long as they see us with arms in our hands, they imagine themselves our equals in birth and bravery. But let them behold us with no other weapon but the whip, and they will feel that they are our slaves and flee before us." The Scythians followed this counsel, and the slaves were so astounded that they forgot to fight and immediately ran away. Such was the mode in which the Scythians, after being for a time the lords of Asia and being forced to quit by the Medes, returned and settled in their own country. I think the story stands for itself, and so I will not discuss it any further. However, before one can become a man, one has to be a boy, and before one attains his own dominion, and even after, one is subject to the dominion of another, with even kings being subject to the dominion of God. I want to open this part by pointing out that in any fight it is always the defender, not the aggressor, who starts the fight. One of the most important areas where this is not understood within our time is the home in the case of domestic abuse. When husbands hit their wives, it is not because they are pushing towards something, but because they are defending themselves from something. Something that is sometimes from outside the home, but usually something domestic. That is, in the majority of domestic abuse cases, the husband hits the wife after she gets under his skin. The situation is an abuse of strength, but not of his strength per se, for if he were truly strong, he would have been unmoved by her. Instead, it signals that she was able to move him, which made him act reflexively in order to scale the balance of power by defending himself. Domestic abuse doesn't happen in households where the husbands are stronger than their wives, but in households where the wives are stronger without being virtuous, or sometimes simply being ignorant to this strength. This example can now be generalized into other scenarios. On the playground, bullies, who we now know typically are children with lower testosterone, often find a way to rile up their victim so much that it aggressively charges them, upon which they then direct the attention of an adult to the scene who promptly punishes the child that has been riled up. In the Western world, Western peoples have been taught to rebel against and discard their governments. This culminated in the situation the West is in presently, where deeply upset and insecure feeling elites relentlessly abuse their subject populations because these populations uncovered the proverbial nakedness of their rulers. Such scenarios always end up in the same way. Neither side wins in a fight that might best be illustrated in a messy and heated United States divorce battle. However, in his Confessions, St. Augustine relays an example of the exact opposite scenario. a woman who, through subjugation to her husband, rather than by trying to dominate him, ultimately turned a vicious drunk and adulterer into an acceptable man. He tells us that she took great care never to offend him when he was riled up, and in those moments to rather assure and comfort him, only taking up issues and proposals to him once his storm had passed. As such, she behaved exactly in the opposite way as Ham did towards Noah. Rather than uncovering her husband's nakedness, she hid it even from herself, who might be seen as endowed to it. The same fashion marks Christianity's triumph over pagan Rome. Christians didn't rebel against the pagan empire, but rather subjugated themselves to it and tried their best to do good to it in the moments as its wrath boiled down. After they had surpassed and triumphed over Rome, Christendom came to cover the nakedness of this old empire, and so it was revered in Christendom until the very last moment. And the ability to sway the sovereign is not the only virtue in submission. Like a son needs to submit to his father, so submission is the first step towards achieving dominance. We must first submit before we can demand submission from others. But that is also why in the marital vows it is customary for the man to kneel first. And finally, even if we never surpass the dominus, like for example in the case of a king and a commoner, submission to a just ruler makes us too beneficiaries of his good deeds, leading to a gain for both parties. And a different example here might again just be the wind and a sailing boat, because even though we never become master of the dominion of wind, by giving into it rather than trying to fight against it, we can use it to sail over a lake. Although it might be surprising for some to hear at first, the natural position for the dominus is the defensive position, and the natural position for the submissive is the aggressive position. One way to exemplify this might be to draw attention to the fact that we pray to God, whilst God doesn't pray to us. The deeper reasons for this will be explained in a video in the addendum dedicated towards conflict and triumph. As such, I will only cover combat briefly in this episode. All the previous points should make it obvious that combat is a boyish, not a masculine pursuit. However, men must be boys before they can be men, and they must be weak before they can be strong. To allow men to be weak, then, is to allow them to fight. One good example is that historically the US carved out new dominion for its youth, so they didn't necessarily have to fight, which is why it is having issues currently, now that its people can't really avoid one another like that anymore. The only acceptable reason for combat is that the target is disordered and dangerous. This is ingrained in the human psyche, which is why all war propaganda always looks the same. However, the psyche can be easily tricked by sin, inner emotional turmoil, or other things, which is why the virtues, and from them especially the nurtured forbearance and equanimity towards the world, are again so important. An offense feeds upon the resources previously begotten. Therefore, living aggressively, it is like being trapped in the snow and doing jumping jacks to keep warm. If it's only for a short while and we get proper rest and nourishment afterwards, it will yield tremendous results. If you're trapped for longer, then simple stuff like walking would have been a better idea. This is also the difference between a crunch in business, whereby one does a ridiculous amount of work in 3 or 4 days, often working more than 16 hours each day, and a more normal processing of a task over the duration of many days or even weeks. If two factions fight one another, the one to win is the last to lose. Losing comes from the word loosening, and means simply the breaking up of one's dominion. So a conflict between two parties can be simply understood as the mashing against each other of two structures until one disintegrates. This is also illustrated by the saying, "United we stand, divided we fall." Finally, the more beholden to a truth a structure is, the stronger it is. However, the stronger a structure, the more it is able to in turn bend truth. And this leads us to the final part of the video, the bluff. The bluff is the projection of power that doesn't actually exist. Like power, it is not inherently evil. However, evil, whose disordered nature predisposes it towards weakness, often resorts to it for compensation. So will the perverse in our time bluff that they represent the sentiment of the many, and thereby threaten their agenda into place. In the field of exorcism, it is almost routine that demons will over-report their own powers in hopes of scaring the exorcist or his aides. The biggest bluff, however, might just be death itself. As death is the final and penultimate bluff, once one has eternal life, they cannot be threatened. It can be understood as a bluff because God is where the afterlife is, and so then the same veil between us and God is the veil between us and the afterlife. Imagine death, then, as a dark abyss. If we don't know what is at the bottom, we will dread to ever fall down, whilst if we know that it is laid in soft cushions, we would not particularly mind falling. The interesting thing here is that this effect of knowledge, proving us against the bluff or threat of death, is greatly diminished if the knowledge is only intellectual in nature. Instead, it needs to be a deep, instinctive trust to fully convince us. An older meaning of knowledge that will be covered in video 0.13. This does not mean that one should go seeking death, however. Entering the house of a friend uninvited is an affront to friendship. Instead, this recognition should make one enter into an almost romantic dance with divinity, to which death will just be the crescendo that gives homage to the fact that God made skeletons so that they always seem to be smiling.